My name is Randy Miller, and I'm with Thompson Hine. And today's speakers are going to be David Schwartz, Brent Connor, and Scott Diamond. David is the practice group leader for the Thompson Hine International Trade and Customs Practice Group. Brent Connor is senior counsel, and Scott Diamond is senior legislative and regulatory policy advisor. Part of today's presentation was also contributed by Samir Varma, who is a partner in the group but is unable to join us today. While we're waiting for a few attendees to get online and be able to see all that you are seeing now, I'm going to go over a little bit of what the format of today's program will look like and how you can submit questions as we go along. Just to let you know, we're going to have several small presentations. At the end of each presentation, we'll do a quick question and answer period, probably 1 to 2 questions, depending on the topic, and then we'll move on to the next topic of the day. We also wanted to let you know that at the end of today's program, we'll have ample time for questions and answers to cover any portion of the program that you may have seen. If you are interested in submitting a question to our speakers today, you have 2 options to do so. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to click on one of the buttons that will allow you to create an opportunity to put this into a question. And then the second piece, if you are unable to do that, is to simply send out an email to trade@thompsonhine.com.
Thanks, Randy, and thank you all online for joining us today to talk about international trade policy in the Trump administration. We could easily talk all day about trade issues and President Trump. In fact, we could probably spend all day just talking about trade relations between the United States and Mexico, given the recent war of words that have erupted in the last 24 hours between President Trump and President Nieto of Mexico. But we won't do that. We've identified 7 issues that candidate Trump stressed throughout the campaign, and these 7 issues are in fact issues that President Trump has been discussing since he entered office last week. They are China, Cuba, Iran, Russia, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and issues related to trade enforcement. If during the course of our discussion we don't touch upon a topic of particular interest to you, we encourage you to follow up with us offline either after the program or when it's convenient for you, and we'll provide you our contact information at the end of this discussion. Before we get started on those topics, we wanted to provide you a quick rundown of the key players on President Trump's trade team. We're going to start in the West Wing with the newly formed White House National Trade Council. President Trump's establishment of this council announced to the world that President Trump intends to make trade a top priority. The council members are not subject to confirmation. The council is being led by Peter Navarro. He's a university economics professor who advised Trump throughout the campaign on trade issues. He's been outspoken in the past about China as a trade cheat. He's written a book, he's done a documentary all about China and how China cheats the world and cheats the United States. The title of his documentary and book is called Death by China. Navarro has also been outspoken about reforming the World Trade Organization to improve its trade enforcement functions. On the council, Navarro will be joined by Jason Greenblatt. Greenblatt's a lawyer and high-ranking Trump Organization official who will be the White House's special representative for international negotiation. Also on the council will be Ralph Lundberg. He's a longtime Washington insider who's worked as a lobbyist and congressional staffer. He'll be in charge of the Buy American, Hire American initiative. That's a phrase that President Trump has been repeating over and over again. He mentioned it in his inaugural address. This is very important to him in increasing manufacturing and increasing job numbers here in the United States. The other members of the Trump trade team are the more traditional ones, those that lead executive branch agencies. I'd like to highlight a few now who've been talking trade the most in the transition period and since Trump took over as president last week. Probably the most important secretary of an executive agency will be Wilbur Ross as Secretary of Commerce. He's been approved in committee, but he still awaits full Senate confirmation, which is expected. Ross is a billionaire who made his money as a distressed industry turnaround artist. He has steel industry experience dating back to the early 2000s. And while he was in the steel business, he became convinced of the importance of strong trade enforcement remedies, and also he realized the trade threat from China. President Trump has tapped Ross to lead his trade team to set trade policy and to address existing and future trade deals. It's likely that Ross will lead any renegotiation of NAFTA. That means that Robert Lighthizer, who's been nominated for U.S. Trade Representative, assuming he's confirmed, may have less to do than most USTRs in the past. But Lighthizer is a strong addition to the team. He's a former deputy USTR, and he spent the last 30 years as an attorney representing domestic industries, especially big steel, in trade remedy cases. Lighthizer is expected to enforce a protectionist trade policy and take a tough stance against China. Steve Mnuchin is the Secretary of Treasury nominee, and if he's confirmed, he'll head the department that's home to OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which oversees economic sanctions programs like those in place against Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The Treasury Department also issues reports on whether countries are currency manipulators, like China, and that's an issue that's likely to come up soon in the early days of the Trump administration. There are two other trade team members who deserve mention. General John Kelly, who was confirmed last week as Secretary for DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. He oversees Customs, that's Customs and Border Protection. And Rex Tillerson, who's been approved in committee, but still awaits Senate confirmation as Secretary of State. He will be supervising the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, DDTC. Now I'd like to hand off to my colleague Brent Connor, who will start with the first topic regarding President Trump and trade policy with China.
Great. Thanks, David. For the following part of the presentation, we're going to focus first on a few countries that are pertinent with regard to trade issues, and we're going to talk about initiatives that Trump has announced with regard to each country, and then the steps that would be adopted for implementing those initiatives, and then the possible impact of those initiatives on U.S. businesses. So looking at China first, I'm sure you're all familiar that with statements during the campaign and after the election that President Trump called for two action items with regard to China. First of all, he wants China identified as a currency manipulator. And secondly, he wants to increase the number of trade cases against China. So Trump said that he would do this both at the WTO and with domestic cases here in the United States. All right, so how would the Trump administration accomplish these initiatives? For identifying China as a currency manipulator, Trump only needs to send a directive to the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Treasury Department would then commence an investigation. It just so happens that there's a statute that it's called the Omnibus Foreign Trade and Competitive Act of 1988, and it would require the Department of the Treasury to determine whether China manipulates its currency to gain an unfair advantage in international trade. He could also ask the Department of Commerce to investigate whether China's undervalued currency amounts to a subsidy that should be addressed through the adoption of countervailing duties on Chinese goods imported into the United States. Turning now to the trade case initiative, the Trump administration could self-initiate anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases under the Tariff Act of 1930, and presumably those investigations would continue to treat China as a non-market economy, which in turn, if dumping or subsidies are found and harm to U.S. industry is found, could result in very high tariffs on Chinese goods. There's also another avenue for investigations of unfair trade practices. It would be under the Trade Act of 1974, and there are two provisions that the Trump administration could rely on. Section 201, which is known as the Safeguard Rules, that section addresses injuries that are caused by increased imports, and the remedy would be tariffs or quotas. And then Section 301 investigations under the Trade Act of 1974 authorizes the president to take appropriate action if unfair trade practices are found. And those also could be in the form of tariffs or quotas. A third avenue would be to direct the U.S. Trade Representative to initiate dispute resolution processes before the WTO. We heard this week, if anyone was following the trade press, that the WTO just approved a dispute settlement panel to hear a matter involving China's support for certain agricultural products. All right, turning now to impact, if we focus first on currency manipulation, if it's deemed a subsidy as a result of the investigations either by the Treasury Department or the Commerce Department, that would result in duties on Chinese imports. And then in regard to the increased number of trade cases, if those are successful, those also would result in anti-dumping and countervailing duties against Chinese imports. So the combined impact from all the China initiatives and the Trump administration could result, though, in retaliation from China. China could launch its own WTO cases against the U.S. It could retaliate against U.S. imports into China, and it could make it difficult or impossible for U.S. companies to conduct business in China. As the trade press has reported, we could end up in a trade war with China, and then we're going to have to ask ourselves who would win, and really who has more to lose. We have to remember that China remains the largest financier of American debt, and so if the People's Bank of China were to start selling off its share of U.S. treasuries, the value of T-bills could fall, and that could lead to a downturn in the global economy, and that would exert pain, I think, probably on all countries, including China and the United States. There are other measures that China could choose to pursue as well, like cutting imports from certain U.S. industries, like U.S. aviation, and that could result in China then turning to our business rivals so that they would be buying, say, Airbus aircraft instead of Boeing. I guess in the interest of time, I'll stop there and move on to our next country.
Before you hop into Cuba, Brent, I just wanted to, we have one quick question, and this is probably something that all of our speakers can address at some point during the course of their program, is that how will whatever proposed policies we end up having in place during the course of the Trump administration affect the sale and price of consumer-related goods that are sold in the United States but are manufactured outside of the United States, things such as food products, electronics, etc.?
Well, if there are tariffs, and first let's take tariffs. If there are tariffs, anything that has goods coming in from China with higher duties, that's going to impact the price of goods that are sold here in the United States. There are a lot of items that come in as components that are incorporated into or finished here in the United States. Those goods are going to be more expensive. With regard to quotas, we're going to have to find alternative sources. And if we don't find alternative sources, if there's a scarce supply of items, then that's going to drive the price up for U.S. consumers.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. All right. Turning quickly to Cuba, it's a unique situation because President Trump's position regarding Cuba has really evolved somewhat over the past year or so, and it's difficult to predict exactly what he's going to be doing going forward. I mean, if you look at statements before the campaign, he thought that opening relations with Cuba was fine. He just wanted a stronger deal. But then leading up to the election and right before the election, he said that, look, I want to reverse the executive orders that Obama adopted that relaxed the Cuban sanctions. And then after he won the election, but upon Fidel Castro's death, he stated that he would terminate the deal unless Cuba agrees to a better deal for Cubans, Cuban Americans, and the United States. So if he were to ratchet back the executive orders that the Obama administration adopted, it's important to remember, looking now at implementation, it's important to remember that, you know, the recent changes that normalized somewhat relations with Cuba and that led to some expanded trade in very limited areas, those were adopted pursuant to presidential policy directives. So that means that President Trump can simply issue a new policy directive that would reverse the changes that were adopted in 2015 and 2016. So the question becomes, okay, is President Trump actually going to do this? You know, he's known as a pragmatist, so he may keep some measures in place and preserve détente in some areas. Also, those familiar with the Trump team's thinking, it's been reported, say that Trump is not really expected to completely reverse the prior administration's directives. Rather, they think he'll probably just push harder for U.S. businesses and individuals to recover property that's been expropriated by the Cuban government. Until then, it's expected that he, you know, obviously there wouldn't be any anything that's expansive with regard to relaxing the sanctions. All right, but let's think for a minute on what would happen if we did start ratcheting back the relaxation of the sanctions. Let's look at the potential impact. Right now, some U.S. businesses are exporting goods to Cuba under recent license exceptions. If those license exceptions are repealed, U.S. businesses are going to have to halt those deliveries and they're going to have to seek licenses. So then the question becomes, okay, are they going to get a license? You know, what's the new policy going to be if you repeal those exceptions? Do we still want to help the Cuban people and allow exports of building materials for their homes? Do we want to help entrepreneurs and continue to export supplies for their businesses? You know, do we want Cubans to still have access to internet service? Another thing that could happen is the elimination of authorized financial transactions. And by this I mean there could be an elimination of authorized credit card purchases for Americans when they're visiting Cuba. We might also lose services that are performed by U.S. banks right now, like account access for Cubans in the United States, remittances from Cuba and Cuban nationals in third countries to the United States, processing of U.S. dollar instruments presented by Cuban financial institutions. Those could be eliminated. In terms of the authorized traveler categories, those could be trimmed significantly. The authorization to travel to Cuba for the purpose of professional meetings, that may go by the wayside. It's been reported that Trump does not like the educational travel authorization for engaging with the Cuban people. That will probably go away. You know, what we might be left with is authorization only for family visits and travel related to humanitarian, religious, or formal education programs by higher, you know, institutions of higher learning. We also have to ask what's going to happen to scheduled air transportation services for passengers and cargo. You know, huge investment was made by airlines to obtain frequencies, move around their fleet, and commence scheduled service to Cuba, arrange for services at airports, ground services, etc. Now, hopefully there, Trump, the pragmatist, will prevail and scheduled service won't be effective. But the problem is, if other changes are made, you know, will scheduled service be economically feasible, especially if the authorized traveler categories are cut back? And then this would impact cruise lines as well, because they now have the authorization to call it Cuban ports. Under the new Cuban regulations, U.S. businesses were permitted to establish physical presence in Cuba. That might go away, and in which case those businesses would be forced to close those locations. And so then the question, you know, on a grander level becomes, what about the businesses that have already made investments to do business in Cuba? What's going to happen to them? Is there any way that they could get that investment back? I mean, that's a real issue. So again, in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but those are just some considerations that we have to think about.
Brent, with respect to the last point that you made about recouping investments that have already taken place, should the Trump administration either repeal or restrict some of the existing commercial opportunities that are available, will this happen on an immediate basis, or will there be a rollout that will be phased that will allow companies to get remittances for the last of the inventory that they may have shipped there, et cetera?
All right, so if President Trump revokes directives, Obama's directives, I would hope that there would be baked in with that revocation a winding down period that's going to allow for divestiture and, you know, for making arrangements for compliance. Because if you're intertwined already with Cuban business, you're not going to be able to just stop overnight. So and OFAC has done this in the past. So it's a common practice. So yeah, they should definitely allow for a winding down period. I mean, that would be my hope. That would be my expectation. Although, you know, a lot remains to be seen.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Scott, you want to start us off on our next topic?
Yes, I'm happy to. The next series of slides relate to what President Trump and his administration may do with regard to Iran and the so-called nuclear deal. Just some quick background on that. The nuclear deal, as it's commonly known, is actually called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And it was reached in July of 2015, and the members are China, France, Germany, Russia, the UK, and the United States, along obviously with Iran. And its purpose was to ensure that Iran's nuclear program would be used for peaceful means, and in return of relaxing various sanctions, both the United States and the European Union relaxing sanctions, Iran would give up its nuclear weapons program. And the agreement, the nuclear deal, went into effect in January, and that's when certain sanctions were indeed relaxed. As you can see from this slide, however, President Trump has not been a fan of the nuclear deal. And throughout the campaign, he repeated criticism of the deal, and at one point even calling it the highest level of incompetence. But however, as president-elect, he began to shift his stance on that, and more recently has been indicating he might just wish to renegotiate the deal or consider new sanctions. But there are even two different positions within his new administration. You have the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, who has tweeted that he looks forward to rolling back the deal with, quote, the world's largest state-sponsored terrorism. But then you have Defense Secretary Mattis stating that while it's an imperfect arms control agreement, he feels like America gave its word and we have to live up to our word and work through this. Some key things to really understand about the nuclear deal is that it's not a treaty. It never required Senate ratification, and it only reflects non-binding commitments by the parties. And although it was agreed to by a U.S. Senate Security Council resolution, still the agreement is not a legally binding document. The Obama administration put it in place by waiving various statutory sanctions and the termination of certain executive orders. Thus, at the end of the day, President Trump and his administration really have no legal barrier to revoking the deal and walking away from it. So on our next slide, what is the impact? What is the possible impact of Trump's election and what his new administration may do? The broad answer is many questions remain as to his intent towards Iran. While he could walk away from the deal, even many original opponents are now questioning the wisdom of that because it would do two immediate things. One, it would potentially allow Iran to go back to resuming its nuclear weapons program, and number two, it could actually isolate the United States from many of our allies, the other parties to the agreement.
because they've indicated they're likely going to remain parties to the deal. And in that regard, even renegotiation of the agreement would be, I think, extremely difficult given the amount of effort that really went into putting the agreement in place and the multiple parties involved in brokering the deal. And back to our allies, just this past November, after President Trump was elected, the EU foreign ministers met and reaffirmed their commitment to the deal. And further, from the Iranian side, you have President Rouhani, who's made clear in recent weeks that he will resist any U.S. changes to the agreement. And further, he argues that no one party has the right to alter the agreement. So the next question we come to on impact is, what about new sanctions or reimposition of sanctions? I think if sanctions are reimposed, if the Trump administration decides to back away a little bit, I think the most significant issue would be our allies, again, and trading partners would really chafe at any reimposition of the secondary sanctions, and those are the sanctions that go beyond U.S. jurisdiction, essentially reach out to some of our foreign trading parties. But the other issue is potential for new sanctions, and we don't necessarily know exactly where President Trump stands on this, but we're learning as the weeks go by with the new session of Congress that there's some desire for members of Congress, and they've actually already introduced new legislation to indeed impose some additional sanctions on Iran. Another issue to consider on the impact is, does the Trump administration adhere to the agreement and just simply decide that they are going to strictly enforce it, meaning that there will be a zero tolerance for any violations by Iran, no matter how large or small. And this is currently, I think, possibly the most likely current scenario in the immediate future. And the question to ask there is, would that eventually make Iran walk away? But overall, I think with the impact you have to, and President Trump's possible actions, is you have to understand that the Trump administration is going to be more confrontational in their approach with Iran. And my last point here is, let's not forget about the Iranian side of this equation. Are they going to, you have to consider it from their end, and I think we need to ask, are they going to consider pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable, like the ballistic missile tests they've run in the past? If they walk away, are they going to try to paint the Trump administration as the cause? And importantly, and this hasn't gotten a lot of press, is that Iran has its own presidential election in May of this year, and recent polls are showing that President Rouhani is losing some popularity because the agreement is not opening up the markets like they thought. So will he be reelected? And he's the pragmatist that fought for this deal. So so that's it with Iran, if we have any questions.
Yeah, we had a question come in, Scott, that asks, President Trump has been critical of this deal, as you've indicated, and Iran is now set to import another 130 tons of uranium from Russia as part of this deal. This is inflaming, many people within the United States on the conservative side of the aisle. What happens to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action if the United States pulls out? What happens to the other countries that were a member of this agreement? Do they go forward without us, or?
Well, I think the 130 tons of uranium has gotten a lot of press actually over in Europe, and not quite as much here in the U.S. Just a real quick background on that from the questioner. It's what is being shipped is natural uranium, not enriched uranium, so it's not weapons grade. And actually, that occurred, a prior shipment occurred in 2015, where in exchange for shipping out enriched uranium, Russia shipped in some natural uranium. The State Department has commented that there's no prohibition on this, and the White House and those monitoring say it will strictly be monitored and inspected. But to get back to your question, the other parties to the agreement have indicated that they have no intention of walking away from this deal at this time unless there are major violations on the part of Iran. then and only then would they consider the snapback provisions. I think on the U.S. side of the equation, this shipment just gives critics further ammunition that the Trump administration should walk away from the deal.
Okay, so let's move on to Russia for the next one.
As you can see from these slides, President Trump hopes to have a good relationship with Russia. But let me give you some quick historic perspective here. You know, while he wishes to have a good relationship with Russia, and that's certainly not a bad thing, the United States and Russia, as I think we all know, have a long history of strained relationships, and most recently that has been evidenced in Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea from Ukraine and the resulting sanctions that were put in place by the United States and again also the European Union. On our next slide, you'll see that while Trump praised the Russian president as a strong leader, on the last slide you just saw his tweets about wanting better relationships. This has led to some speculation that he'll attempt to roll back the existing sanctions against Russia. But again, we've seen some different viewpoints from his new administration. His nominee for Secretary of the Treasury has stated that he currently opposes lifting the sanctions. And again, Secretary Mattis, Secretary of Defense, indicated at his confirmation hearing that Russia raises grave concerns for him on several fronts. So, you know, where does this leave the relationship during the Trump presidency? He wants closer ties and compliments the Russian president. Members of his cabinet are a little bit more circumspect on this issue and the relationship. So I think overall we just have to realize and understand that as the world's two biggest countries, we have different geopolitical goals here, and our relationships will never be without some certain amount of friction. So implementation, you know, what about any type of implementation of a Russia policy under President Trump? We certainly view it as unlikely that he would recognize the legitimacy of Russia's annexation of Crimea, again, because it would complicate our relationships with our European allies, particularly our NATO relationship and countering any Russian aggression. And while Trump could relax sanctions, and as indicated he may do so, he's put conditions on that. He wants Russia to agree to further nuclear arms reductions, and he wants assistance, meaningful assistance in combating terrorism. But as I'll mention in a couple more seconds, he'll face extensive pushback from Congress at this point on relaxing sanctions. But ultimately, as Brent has mentioned with some of the other countries and with Iran, these were put into place by executive orders under President Obama, so Trump could revoke those executive orders. One roadblock would be the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014 that does require the president to impose certain sanctions against entities in Russia for any activities in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, or Syria. On our next slide, the impact of possible relationship. While he might want better relations with Russia, I think there could be a significant political cost at this time. Our relationships with that country have been tense for over a decade now, as Russia seeks to reassert itself in the world. And congressional attitude towards Russia is just extremely negative at this point, and bipartisan so, in fact. Senator McCain feels sanctions need to be kept, and actually more sanctions need to be in place, and he and others have actually called Vladimir Putin a war criminal for the activities in Syria. And on January 11th, there was some bipartisan legislation introduced in the Senate that, if enacted, would codify many existing sanctions. Any significant policy change by Trump would, again, have faced some pushback from our European allies. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott. I think we're just going to jump right into the next two topics, so I'm going to turn this over to David.
Thanks, Randy. I'm going to be tackling in rapid succession two free trade agreements. One that's been around for a long time, NAFTA, which entered into force in 1994 and involves the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And the other, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was signed last year, involving 12 Pacific Rim countries, including the United States. First, let's turn to NAFTA. Throughout the campaign, candidate Trump railed against NAFTA, calling it defective and the worst trade deal ever signed. It was a key plank of his 100-day plan upon entering the office of president. He described two options that he would pursue. He would either renegotiate NAFTA or simply withdraw from it. Earlier this week, President Trump called for NAFTA's renegotiation. He did not issue an executive order. We expect one to be issued shortly. He also announced earlier in the week that meetings had been scheduled in the next couple weeks with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada and President Nieto of Mexico to discuss the possible renegotiation of NAFTA. Given what's happened in the last 24 hours, President Nieto canceled the meeting with President Trump that was scheduled for Tuesday because of President Trump's executive order announcing that a security wall would be built along the southern border of the United States with Mexico, and also a question about who would pay for it. Let's look at the two options that President Trump has raised regarding NAFTA. To renegotiate NAFTA, it's straightforward. Under NAFTA Article 2202, all three parties would have to agree. Interestingly, in the United States, a renegotiated NAFTA would require approval by both houses of Congress because it remains a congressional executive agreement. On the flip side, if the United States were to withdraw from NAFTA, we would invoke Article 2205 of the treaty, giving 6 months' notice to Mexico and to Canada. And under Section 125 of the Trade Act of 1974, the President could unilaterally withdraw from NAFTA without any congressional approval. Let's talk about the impact of these potential policies. We'll start first with unilateral withdrawal. In terms of impact, a unilateral withdrawal by the United States would be a dramatic move in theory, but it would take at least 18 months to do it. Under the Trade Act of 1974, there's a 1-year transition period, and as I already mentioned, under Article 2205 of NAFTA, there's 6 months' notice. If, in fact, the United States were to withdraw from NAFTA, at best, there would be a change in rates that would apply to imports and exports among the three countries. The WTO rules would kick in, and so the most favored nation rates for the U.S. would apply, and that would be 3.5% on most imported items. Mexico's MFN preferential rates are much higher, though. So U.S. exports to Mexico might face rates as high as 36% or even higher for most imported items. For U.S. exports to Canada, the Canadian MFN preferential rates aren't too bad. They would be around 4.2% for most imported items. Let's talk about what would happen if a trade war were declared, and which may become more real as time rolls on. Under the trade war scenario, President Trump, under current U.S. law, has many options to increase tariffs significantly. Under the Trade Act of 1974, he has a number of sections, Section 125, Section 301, and Section 122 that would all allow him to increase tariffs almost as much as he wants. It gives him great discretion. He also has, under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Section 232, the ability to declare a national security threat caused by imports and to also impose significant tariffs. Even under IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the president would be able to impose tariffs by declaring an unusual and extraordinary threat. Despite what's happened today between the U.S. and Mexico, I think we all believe that renegotiation still is the most likely scenario under Article 2202 of the NAFTA. More than likely, the renegotiation of NAFTA would be based on provisions that have been negotiated among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trump trade team members have in fact called TPP NAFTA 2.0. So that's likely to be the starting point for any negotiation. And such areas that would probably be addressed right from the start in any NAFTA renegotiation would cover rules of origin for certain products, e-commerce, intellectual property, labor environmental protections, and anti-corruption provisions. Now, let's talk about the impact that would hit companies if there were a change in the NAFTA terms. I think at base, any change to NAFTA after 23 years would play havoc with a company's international supply chain. And it would just be difficult for companies to continue in the mode of business they've been using without making some changes. Companies have already been in the process of identifying concerns that they have with NAFTA if it were to be changed, and they've also identified improvements that they want to make. They've contacted their trade associations, they've contacted their members of Congress, and they've begun lobbying for changes that they think would benefit them. But it's clear that after 23 years of companies setting in place supply chains, that any change in NAFTA, at least in the near term, is going to create an adverse effect on companies in the United States. Let's turn now to TPP. And this is something that's breaking news. On Monday of this week, President Trump withdrew from TPP, as he promised during the campaign. He issued a memo to the USTR to undertake formal procedures under 30.6 of the TPP Charter to withdraw the United States from the agreement. Based on recent comments, both from Trump and from his administration officials, it does not appear that Trump plans on renegotiating TPP. It appears that we will walk away from it and focus on bilateral deals in the region instead. In terms of implementation, this is probably the easiest trade proposal that Trump is going to be initiating. Because the United States hasn't ratified it yet, what the U.S. walking away from TPP does is officially destroy the TPP as a pact, because the TPP required that all signatories ratify the agreement within 2 years of signing the agreement. That's not going to happen now. And the other option was that at least 6 signatories to the agreement, together that had a gross domestic product of more than 85% of total GDP, would have to agree to it. Because the United States represents at least 62% of total GDP for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP depended on the participation of the United States. Finally, and most importantly, let's talk about the impact of the United States withdrawal from TPP. And there are a few that I want to address here. First, the other countries that are signatories to the TPP will find a substitute without the United States. They could just continue the TPP without the United States and simply change language in certain provisions of the Charter to address requirements that necessarily included the United States going back to a year ago. They could also consider participating in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is an ongoing treaty negotiation between China and members of the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations. It also includes Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and New Zealand. The TPP signatories other than the United States could also enter enter into bilateral free trade agreements with China. China is the largest trade partner for many of these TPP countries. And finally, the TPP signatories could enter into another ongoing trade pact negotiation called the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, which would include the TPP countries along with China and Russia. What does this mean for the United States stepping away from the TPP? Well, the Trump trade team has made it clear that they do not favor multilateral agreements at all and that they would prefer bilateral deals. The United States already has in place free trade agreements with a number of TPP countries: Australia, Canada, Chile, Mexico, and Singapore. It's likely now that the United States will attempt to launch bilateral free trade agreement talks with Japan. That would clearly address the biggest economic benefit the United States would have received from TPP. Japan's the world's third largest economy and has erected significant market access barriers that would have been lowered by TPP and would likely be lowered through an FTA. It's unclear, though, whether Japan would embrace FTA talks with the United States. Prime Minister Abe has been a staunch supporter of TPP. Japan just ratified the TPP, and recently in the news, it was revealed that Japan has had talks with Australia and has made it clear that Japan will still try to convince the United States to stay with the TPP. Finally, one of the most interesting impacts of TPP withdrawal is the geopolitical impact of it. Will the United States be ceding economic leadership in that part of the world to China, Japan, and Russia? I think it's clear that there will be a power vacuum of some sort, and one of those three countries may jump in to take the lead in an Asian economic community. In that sense, it would not, at least initially, look good for the United States because we would be screened out of an Asian preferential tariff system, much like we are screened out now of the EU. Looking on the positive side, the U.S. will likely focus on bilateral deals in the Pacific Rim region, which might limit potential loss in economic benefits and the loss of any economic leadership there. And now Scott will turn to trade enforcement.
Thank you, David. And I think that's a really important point, the last point on the geopolitical aspects of the collapse of TPP, or at least the walking away. I'm going to try to move more quickly through the trade enforcement because we've covered a lot of this already in some of our country-specific discussions. The first two bullet points here go back to what Brent mentioned at first about the 7 points in President Trump's 7-point trade plan. He wants commerce to go after every violation in the USTO to bring cases both in the U.S. and the WTO. So that's using existing trade tools to enforce our agreements. And the threat of imports, tariffs, and border taxes, that has gotten a lot of press, as everybody knows, since President Trump has threatened steep import tariffs. So how would this be implemented? We're assuming that at first President Trump and his administration are indeed going to take advantage of existing trade laws to bring various enforcement actions, including, as Brent mentioned, towards China, probably self-initiating some dumping countervailing duty investigations, and that's indeed historically a relatively rare action. And he's also, we foresee that he will indeed take a more aggressive stance in enforcing provisions of trade agreements, again under various provisions of under the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. The USTR not only helps negotiate trade agreements, but also is there to enforce them. And one of those, as Brent said, is Section 301. Despite some early comments about withdrawing from WTO, it looks now like Trump now wishes to use that as an avenue for trade disputes. And then we have his well-known threat to slap a 35% tariff on imports from China and to place tariffs on products where U.S. companies have moved offshore and are bringing their products back inside. So for impact, what do we have as possible impact for trade enforcement? First, we're going to have the effectiveness of any trade remedy case is going to depend upon many factors. four of which are covered here on this slide, which go more directly to dumping countervailing duty cases and the scope of those investigations and what can actually be enforced and retaliated against. And the other one where WTO is involved is that the countries would first enter into consultations. As for authority, yes, Trump definitely has the authority to impose tariff. Congress typically constitutionally has that power, but through legislation they've ceded a lot of that to any president through legislation. And Trump's nominees have again indicated that it's a complicated issue, slapping tariffs on people, but Mr. Ross, during his nomination, indicated that imposing a tariff is a good negotiating tactic. The final point here is what's been making some press this past week is the border adjustment tax. That's actually not initially a Trump administration. That was formulated by the House Republicans as a tax that would reduce taxes on exports but raise them on imports as an incentive to keep U.S. businesses producing here in the U.S. Trump was initially critical of that, saying it was too complicated, and members of trade practitioners are quite certain that any such tax would be challenged before the WTO. And I'm hoping that leaves us with plenty of time to answer some questions here.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. That does wrap up the programming section of our program today. But one of the questions that I've been getting, in fact, it's come through a couple of different people, and you touched on it on your very last slide, was, yes, the president can impose tariffs, but how easy is it to do so? What are the limitations going to be in terms of like the amount or the restrictions on products or services, et cetera? Anyone on the panel who wants to jump in, but how easily can it be done, and where do we expect it to happen?
Well, I'll go first and let others jump in on it. I think it depends on what statutory provisions the president wants to rely on and what authority actually has been ceded by the Congress. One thing that has received some attention is Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. That gives the president fairly broad powers to retaliate against discrimination in commerce against the United States, because there are only two broad factors are applied in the consideration, and if discrimination is found, that section of the Tariff Act allows for the imposition of duties of up to 50% of a product's value. So it can be far-ranging.
All right, somebody else want to weigh in on that?
Sure, I'll jump in. There are a number of statutory provisions that have been in place for a number of years that will allow the president to retaliate with significantly large tariffs. They haven't been used in decades because of the concern of retaliation. That concern may no longer be there. I think that if there is tough talk, I think we'll need to follow up the tough talk with tough action, and we may see for the first time in decades that many of these statutory provisions, which are in the Trade Act of 1974, Section 232, may in fact be used for the first time in a long time.
Even Section 301 of the Trade Act, it's been dormant for a fair amount of time, in my opinion, and again, that allows fairly broad, that would allow the USTR to kind of resume its role as beyond being a trade negotiator, but a trade enforcer and bringing in a 301 action against a country.
Very good. Another question that we had is looking at all the different potential trade policies that we've mentioned today, is whether or not these might have a specific effect on bilateral trade relations with countries like China, or more universally through spillovers, and what impact could that have on foreign direct investment?
So I'll speak first in that regard. Look, these trade policies could have a negative impact on FDI for businesses and countries that we've focused on. I mean, if you take China, for example, if the purpose of FDI was to bring imports of items that are required here in the United States in at a low price, and we have tariffs and quotas, et cetera, that's going to drive the price of those items up. So the whole purpose of the FDI could be impacted or frustrated. Another impact would be, again, if you look at the case of China, if there's a trade war and China were to make it difficult or impossible for U.S. entities to do business in China, that again would frustrate the purpose of the FDI. Now, the saving grace might be if you've invested in, say, a manufacturing facility in China and you're selling mostly to third countries. If they're not in a trade war with China, that might, there would be no impact by U.S. Trade policies, potentially, unless, again, China decides in a trade war to retaliate against U.S. businesses who are doing business in China. So, those who have invested in China, they might be caught in the middle of a trade war.
Gotcha. Okay. Next question up is, has there been a discussion of possible rollbacks of export control reform?
I haven't seen anything in that regard. In fact, I would be surprised if there was, because, again, Trump is a pragmatist. He wants to create jobs. He wants to have a strong trade position. So I would think that he would be in favor of export control reform, as long as we, protect national security, et cetera, and protect the U.S. position worldwide. I think he would embrace it, personally.
I would agree with Brent. I think that he would recognize, and his advisors would recognize, that export control reform was a good thing. The regulations were so outdated, not addressing modern day ways of doing business and controlling goods, is that it's been a good thing.
And I'll just add one more thing. I mean, one of the points of export control reform was to make U.S. business more competitive globally and stop losing sales to competitors in other countries. And I think that's something that, Trump would definitely embrace.
All right. Well, thanks very much. As we wrap up today, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating. I know we covered a lot of ground, but there have been considerable trade opportunities and initiatives put forth by the Trump administration already. I'm sure that over the course of the first 100 days of his presidency, we expect to have many more opportunities to communicate to you through updates, alerts, potential additional webinars. And we would like you to come back and see trumpandtrade.com, which is our website that has all of this information available for you. I've got a screenshot up here of our updates tab. We're putting anywhere from 2 to 5 updates per week in this section, and you'll be able to see the additional sections there that we covered today in terms of what the policy outlines had been from the campaign until now as they evolve. We really appreciate your participation today. We'll go ahead and send these slides out to you as well. And if you have any follow-up, feel free to contact any member of our team or to send us an email at trade@thompsonhine.com. Thank you very much. We appreciate it, and have a good day.